I never thought I'd end up working the night shift at a museum. It wasn't exactly my dream job, but when you're low on cash and desperate for work, you take what you can get. The advertisement had been simple: night security guard needed. No experience required. I pay. And that was all I needed to apply. The interview had been brief. A man in a dark suit, whom I only knew as Mr. Harrington, had asked a few basic questions before handing me a contract to sign. No background check, no real formalities. Just a simple set of instructions: arrive at 10 p.m., leave at 6 a.m., and make sure no one enters the museum after hours. It sounded easy enough. On my first night, I arrived at the Blackwood Historical Museum 10 minutes early. The building loomed over me, its massive columns and dark stone exterior exuding an eerie atmosphere under the dim glow of the streetlights. The museum had been around for over 100 years, housing relics from ancient civilizations, medieval artifacts, and a surprisingly vast collection of taxidermied animals. I had visited once as a child, but I barely remembered anything about it. Mr. Harrington met me at the entrance. He was a tall, thin man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. "You're early," he noted, his voice devoid of warmth. "Just wanted to make a good impression," I replied, forcing a small laugh. He didn't smile. Instead, he handed me a keycard and a printed sheet of rules. "Follow these instructions carefully," he said. "The security system is old, so don't tamper with it. Your main job is to monitor the cameras and patrol the halls once every hour. And whatever you do," he hesitated, then added, "never turn off the lights in Exhibit Hall C." I frowned at the oddly specific instruction. "Why not?" He didn't answer. Instead, he checked his watch. "Your shift starts now. I'll be in my office until midnight. After that, you're on your own." With that, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the museum, leaving me standing alone in the vast, silent lobby. The security office was a small, cluttered room filled with dusty monitors and old equipment. The walls were covered with faded maps of the museum, emergency contact lists, and handwritten notes from previous guards. I sat down and turned on the monitors, watching as the black and white security feeds flickered to life. For the first hour, everything seemed normal. The museum was empty, the exhibits untouched. The cameras showed the Grand Egyptian exhibit, the medieval armor collection, and the unsettling Hall of Natural History, where rows of taxidermied animals stood frozen in time. Everything was still. Then, at exactly 11:15 p.m., I noticed something strange. One of the cameras in Exhibit Hall C flickered for a moment, and when the image returned, something was different. A statue of a warrior, which had been standing in the center of the room, was now slightly turned to the left. I stared at the screen, my pulse quickening. Had I imagined that? Maybe the feed had glitched, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But as I continued watching, a slow, creeping dread settled in my stomach. Because a few minutes later, the statue had moved again. I tried to shake off the unease and convince myself that there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe the cleaning crew had bumped into it earlier, or maybe my eyes were just tired from staring at the screens. But the feeling of being watched lingered, making my skin prickle with unease. At midnight, I began my first patrol. The museum was even more unsettling in person. Long, empty halls stretched in every direction, the artifacts casting eerie shadows in the dim light. My footsteps echoed against the marble floors as I made my way through the exhibits, checking each room for any signs of intruders. When I reached Exhibit Hall C, I hesitated at the entrance. The room was deathly silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the security cameras mounted in the corners. I stepped inside, my flashlight sweeping over the various artifacts, ancient swords, broken pottery, and statues of warriors and kings from long-forgotten civilizations. And then, I saw it. The warrior statue had moved again. It was now facing the entrance, staring directly at me. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. My heart pounded as I backed away, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But before I could turn, a whisper echoed through the empty hall. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was so quiet, so breathy, that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. Almost. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The room was empty. No signs of movement, no shifting shadows, just rows of ancient relics, watching in silence. I needed to get out of there. Heart racing, I rushed back to the security office and locked the door behind me. I sat in my chair, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe the museum had some automated display I wasn't aware of. Maybe I was just exhausted. But as I stared at the monitors, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The warrior statue was no longer in Exhibit Hall C. It was standing in the hallway, closer to my office, and it was facing the camera. My hands trembled as I stared at the security monitor. The warrior statue, which had been inside Exhibit Hall C just moments ago, was now in the hallway, standing ominously close to my office. My breath hitched in my throat. This had to be some kind of elaborate prank, maybe motion sensors or a hidden mechanism designed to shift the statues for dramatic effect. I leaned forward, staring intently at the monitor. The camera flickered again, just for a second, and when it stabilized, the statue had moved even closer. I swallowed hard. This wasn't normal. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight and the nightstick I had been issued, though I doubted a simple baton would do much against solid stone. My rational mind told me to stay put, lock the door, and wait for morning. But curiosity, or maybe some deep-rooted, idiotic need to understand, forced me to my feet. I had to see for myself. Steeling my nerves, I unlocked the office door and stepped cautiously into the hallway. The museum was deathly quiet, save for the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. The air was stale, carrying the distinct scent of aged paper, dust, and something else, a metallic tang that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The statue was gone. I shone my flashlight down the hallway. The faint beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but the cold, empty corridor. I exhaled sharply, trying to steady my breathing. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of a new job and the late-night shift was getting to me. I took a cautious step forward, my boots echoing against the marble floor. A second step, then a third, and then I heard it. A faint scraping sound, like stone grinding against stone. I spun around, shining my light in every direction. Nothing. But the noise persisted, growing closer, methodical, deliberate. My pulse pounded in my ears as I turned toward Exhibit Hall C. The double doors were slightly ajar. I hadn't left them that way. Taking a deep breath, I nudged the door open with my foot. The exhibit loomed before me, the shadows from the statues stretching unnaturally across the floor. I took a hesitant step inside, sweeping my flashlight over the room. Nothing seemed out of place at first. The ancient artifacts remained behind their glass enclosures, untouched. The warrior statue. It was back in its original position. I froze. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. Had I imagined the entire thing? Had I been staring at the monitor for so long that I had begun seeing things that weren't real? Then the lights flickered. For the briefest of moments, darkness consumed the room. When the fluorescent bulbs buzzed back to life, I felt my stomach drop. The warrior statue was closer. No more than 10 feet away. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I pointed it at the statue. The carved stone eyes seemed to bore into me, unblinking, hollow, and yet somehow full of malice. This wasn't a trick. This wasn't a prank. The statue was moving. I turned on my heel and bolted from the room, slamming the doors shut behind me. My heart hammered against my ribs as I sprinted down the hallway, not daring to look back. My office was only a few feet away. If I could just make it inside. A loud crash echoed behind me. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The doors to Exhibit Hall C had burst open. The warrior statue stood just beyond the threshold, frozen mid-step as if I had caught it in the act. My breath came in short gasps as I fumbled for my keycard. The reader beeped, the door clicked, and I threw myself into the office, slamming it shut behind me. I locked it. Then I backed away from the door, gripping my nightstick so tightly my knuckles turned white. My gaze flickered to the security monitors. The camera feed for Exhibit Hall C was now static. But the hallway feed, the warrior statue was directly outside my office, and it was facing the camera. I stood frozen, unable to tear my eyes away. The screen flickered. When the image returned, the statue was gone. A heavy silence filled the room. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. Then, from the other side of the door, I heard it. A single, deliberate knock. The knock at the door sent a fresh wave of terror through me. It was slow, deliberate, as if whoever, or whatever, was on the other side knew exactly how much fear it was instilling. I held my breath, gripping the nightstick so tightly my fingers ached. Another knock. Louder this time. I swallowed hard, forcing my body to stay still. If this was a prank, it had gone far beyond anything remotely funny. If it wasn't, then I had no idea what I was dealing with. My gaze darted back to the security monitors. The hallway feed flickered, the static dancing across the screen before stabilizing again. The warrior statue was gone. I forced myself to breathe. Slowly, I reached for the printed set of instructions that Mr. Harrington had given me on my first night. My fingers trembled as I unfolded the paper, scanning the neatly typed rules once more. Do not let anyone inside the museum after hours. Patrol the halls once every hour. Keep the lights on in Exhibit Hall C at all times. Do not stare at the Egyptian mask for more than 10 seconds. If you hear a child laughing, lock the doors and do not investigate. If something knocks on the security office door, do not answer. My breath hitched on the final rule. Do not answer. I pressed my back against the chair, willing myself to stay quiet. The museum was ancient, full of artifacts with untold histories. I had chalked up the warnings to superstition, but now, sitting in the dimly lit security office with something knocking outside, I wasn't so sure. The knock came again. Then silence. I waited, counting the seconds in my head. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. Slowly, I leaned forward, glancing back at the monitors. The hallway was empty. My chest heaved with relief, but the unease remained, thick in the air like fog. I needed to finish my rounds, but my gut screamed at me to stay put. The museum felt different now, more than just unsettling. It felt alive. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to move. My shift wasn't over yet. I couldn't just sit in the office and wait for morning. If I didn't do my job, I risked losing it. And something told me that breaking the rules could be even worse than facing whatever was lurking in the halls. I checked the hallway again. Still empty. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness. The faint hum of the security cameras was the only sound as I made my way toward Exhibit Hall C. My footsteps felt too loud against the marble floor, echoing like a warning. When I reached the exhibit, I hesitated. The lights were still on. Good. At least that was one rule I hadn't broken. The warrior statue was back in its original place, frozen in an eternal battle stance. I forced a nervous chuckle. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Maybe the stress of the new job was getting to me. I turned to leave. Then, in the reflection of the glass display case, I saw movement. I spun around, flashlight trembling in my grip. The statue hadn't moved, but something felt wrong. The air was heavier. The shadows seemed deeper. The ancient artifacts seemed to be watching me. Then the lights flickered. Panic surged through me as I stumbled backward. The rule: keep the lights on. My heart pounded as I fumbled for the switch, flipping it back on just as the room was about to be swallowed by darkness. When the fluorescent bulbs flickered back to life, the warrior statue was closer. Too close. It was now only a few feet away, its stone-carved face frozen in an expression that almost looked angry. I staggered back, my mind racing. I hadn't heard it move. I hadn't seen it move. But there it was, undeniably closer than before. My breathing was ragged, my pulse deafening in my ears. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in the security office, locking the door behind me. My hands were shaking as I collapsed into the chair, staring at the monitors. The camera feed for Exhibit Hall C was static again. I needed answers. With trembling fingers, I dug through the cluttered desk drawers, searching for anything that could explain what was happening. Old logbooks, dated reports, notes from previous security guards. Most were mundane, detailing routine patrols and maintenance schedules. But then I found something. An entry from a guard named Daniel Harrington. My blood ran cold. Mr. Harrington. I skimmed the pages, my eyes widening with each line. The statues move when the lights go out. I've seen them. They watch. They follow. I don't know how much longer I can do this. There are rules. Follow them, and you might survive. Break them, and you won't. I think they know I'm onto them. If you're reading this, it's too late for me. My breath hitched. The final entry was dated over 5 years ago, and Daniel Harrington had never been mentioned by my employer. A chill ran down my spine as I turned back to the monitor. The static on the Exhibit Hall C feed flickered away, revealing a dark, empty room. The warrior statue was gone. And then, as if on cue, the sound of slow, deliberate knocking echoed from the office door. The knocking was slow, rhythmic, 3 deliberate taps, a pause, then 3 more. My breath caught in my throat as I backed away from the door, my eyes darting to the security monitors. The hallway camera outside my office flickered with static, then cleared just long enough for me to see it. The warrior statue stood directly outside my door. I gritted my teeth to keep from making a sound. My own rules had been set for me. If something knocks on the security office door, do not answer. I wasn't about to find out what happened if I did. The knocking came again, but this time, something was different. It wasn't just knocking, there was a subtle scraping sound, like stone grinding against stone. A sickening realization hit me. It was testing the door. I reached for the nightstick on my desk, knowing full well it wouldn't do anything against whatever this thing was. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I kept my gaze locked on the monitor. The image flickered once more. The statue was gone. I swallowed hard. My hands were clammy as I gripped the edge of the desk, forcing myself to stay still. I glanced at the other monitors. Exhibit Hall C was empty now, its eerie silence amplified by the absence of the warrior statue. And then, movement. A different camera, this one showing the taxidermy exhibit, caught a flicker of motion in the corner. At first, I thought it was another glitch. But as the image stabilized, I felt my blood run cold. The statue was there now. It stood among the lifeless, glass-eyed animals, its head tilted slightly as if observing them. The contrast between the unmoving taxidermy and the statue that had undeniably changed position sent a fresh wave of terror through me. It was moving while I wasn't looking. I exhaled shakily. My mind screamed at me to stay put, to wait out the shift. But a deeper instinct told me otherwise. If the statue could move freely in the museum, there was no guarantee it wouldn't find its way back to my office. I had to move. I had to get out of here. The museum's emergency exit was down the east wing, near the restoration lab. It wasn't part of my usual patrol, but I knew the layout well enough to navigate it in the dark. If I could get there, maybe, just maybe, I could escape. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, took a deep breath, and unlocked the office door as quietly as I could. The hallway was empty, but I didn't trust my eyes anymore. Keeping my back to the wall, I moved cautiously, my footsteps barely making a sound against the cold marble floor. The silence was unbearable. Every creak of the building, every distant hum of the security system felt amplified. The air was thick with something unnatural, something heavy that pressed against my chest like an invisible weight. I reached the taxidermy exhibit and hesitated. The statue was still there, standing among the frozen animals. Its posture was eerily human, one arm raised slightly, its carved fingers curled as if caught mid-motion. I stepped closer, barely breathing. Then, the lights flickered. Darkness swallowed the hall for half a second. When the lights returned, my stomach lurched. The warrior statue was facing me. I staggered backward, my breath hitching in my throat. It hadn't moved, it couldn't have. But it had. The impossible truth stared back at me, carved in ancient stone. The lights flickered again. I bolted. My legs burned as I sprinted down the corridor, my mind a blur of panic and instinct. I reached the east wing and turned sharply toward the emergency exit. The red exit sign glowed like a beacon in the darkness. I was almost there. Then, I heard it. A scraping sound. Slow. Deliberate. Closer than before. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The warrior statue was at the end of the hallway. It was moving toward me. Not fast. Not running. But with a terrifying certainty, each step measured and methodical. The way its stone feet scraped against the marble floor made my stomach twist with revulsion. It wasn't just shifting locations when I looked away. It was following me. I forced myself to keep moving, heart hammering against my ribs. The exit was just ahead. I reached out, fingers brushing against the metal push bar. The lights flickered again. Everything plunged into darkness. In the pitch-black void, I heard it. Right behind me. The scrape of stone. The whisper of air shifting. A presence looming over me. The lights returned. I wasn't at the exit anymore. I was standing in Exhibit Hall C. My scream caught in my throat as I spun wildly, disoriented. I had been seconds away from escaping. How had I ended up back here? My breath came in ragged gasps as I turned toward the security monitors mounted on the exhibit wall. They were displaying live footage of the museum. And in every camera feed, every exhibit, every hallway, there was only one thing visible. The warrior statue. Hundreds of them. No. One of them. In every location, in every camera, standing motionless. Watching. And then, in the reflection of the monitor, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. The statue wasn't on the screen anymore. It was standing directly behind me. A breath, not my own, brushed against my ear. Then, everything went black. I woke up on the cold marble floor of Exhibit Hall C. My head throbbed, and my limbs felt impossibly heavy, as if my body resisted the very idea of movement. The last thing I remembered was the breath on my ear, the impossible sensation of something that shouldn't be able to breathe standing right behind me. I forced my eyes open. The hall was eerily quiet. The exhibit cases stood undisturbed, their ancient artifacts resting in pristine stillness. For a brief, blissful moment, I thought I had imagined everything. Maybe I had passed out from fear, suffered some sort of panic attack. Then I saw the monitors. Every single screen was black. A cold realization settled in my stomach like a stone. The security feeds had been showing the warrior statue in every location before I lost consciousness. Now, there was nothing. No static. No flickering. Just an empty void where the museum should have been. I swallowed hard and pushed myself to my feet. My muscles screamed in protest, my balance unsteady. As I took a deep breath, my ears picked up the faintest sound, a distant, rhythmic tapping. My pulse quickened. The knocking had returned. I had to get out. That much was clear. But as I turned toward the exit, something was wrong. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the very space around me had shifted. The museum was silent, yes, but it was a different kind of silence. A weighted, expectant stillness that made my skin prickle. I forced my legs to move, one unsteady step at a time. My flashlight flickered as I swept it across the room. The warrior statue was nowhere in sight. That should have been a relief, but instead, it only deepened my sense of dread. Then I checked my watch. 1:17 a.m. Panic surged through me. I knew for a fact that it had been nearly 3 a.m. when I reached for the emergency exit. I hadn't just lost consciousness. I had lost time. My breathing turned shallow. I had no idea how long I had been out or what had happened while I was unconscious. The idea that something had been here, that something had possibly moved me, made my stomach churn. I needed to reach the office. If I could reboot the security feeds, maybe I could find out what had happened. The hallway leading back to the security office felt impossibly long. The exhibits loomed over me in the dim emergency lighting, their shadows stretched and distorted. Every few steps, I swore I heard something shift behind me. Not footsteps, something subtler. A scrape. A whisper of movement just out of sight. I didn't look back. Reaching the office, I all but threw myself inside and locked the door behind me. My fingers fumbled over the keyboard as I tried to access the security system. The monitors remained black, unresponsive to every command I entered. Then a single camera flickered to life. Exhibit Hall C. My breath caught in my throat. The warrior statue was back, standing precisely where it should have been, frozen in its eternal battle stance. But something was wrong. Its head was turned slightly, facing the camera. It had never done that before. I stood there, rooted to the spot, watching the feed as my mind raced. Had it moved? Had I simply never noticed its position before? Or was it acknowledging me, watching me back? Then the camera feed shifted. It wasn't Exhibit Hall C anymore. It was my office. And the camera wasn't showing an empty room. It was showing me. My stomach twisted violently as I realized what I was seeing. The screen displayed my own back, standing at the security terminal, my own shaking hands hovering over the keyboard. But I wasn't alone. Behind me, just out of my line of sight, the warrior statue loomed. I spun around, heart hammering against my ribs, but the room was empty. I gasped for breath, sweat dampening the collar of my uniform. I turned back to the screen. The feed was black again. I had to leave. Now, the rules. I had broken too many of them. The lights in Exhibit Hall C had flickered. I had tried to use the cameras. I had acknowledged what was never meant to be acknowledged. I grabbed my keys and bolted for the door, adrenaline drowning out every rational thought. The hall was darker than before. The emergency lighting flickered erratically, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. I sprinted toward the east wing, determined to reach the exit before whatever was toying with me decided to show itself again. Halfway there, the lights cut out completely. My breath hitched in my throat as I skidded to a stop, swallowing back a scream. I flicked on my flashlight. The weak beam barely pierced the darkness, but it was enough to see the hallway ahead. It was empty. No, not empty. Different. The museum had changed. The exhibits were gone. The walls stretched further than they should have, the architecture twisting in unnatural ways. The marble beneath my feet felt softer, as though I were walking on something not quite solid. And then I saw them. Statues. Hundreds of them. Lining the hallway on both sides, each one frozen in a stance of battle, of agony, of terror. They were identical to the warrior statue, yet all slightly different. Some had broken weapons, others missing limbs. Their faces twisted in expressions that made my skin crawl. I took a slow, shuddering step forward. As I did, I realized something horrifying. They weren't standing in place. They were getting closer. I took another step. They moved again, just slightly. A shift in posture, a tilt of the head. Not enough to see, but enough to know. My throat went dry as I understood. I wasn't supposed to be here anymore. I had broken the rules, and now I was part of the museum's collection. And the statues weren't statues at all. They were watching, waiting. I ran. I ran until my lungs burned, until the darkness seemed to press in from all sides, warping the museum into something unrecognizable. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing off walls that stretched too high and corridors that twisted in ways that defied logic. I didn't care. I just had to keep moving. The statues were following me. I could feel them. Every time the lights flickered, every time my gaze shifted, they moved closer, sharper, more defined. They weren't just frozen figures anymore. They were hunting me. The hallway split into two paths ahead. My mind screamed at me to choose, but my body hesitated, every instinct firing at once. One corridor led deeper into the unknown, its passage narrowing into darkness. The other led toward the restoration wing, where the museum's artifacts were studied and repaired. The rules. I had broken so many already, but I still remembered them. Rule number 6, if you find yourself lost, do not take the hallway that wasn't there before. I turned toward the restoration wing. The room smelled of aged parchment and oil paints, of forgotten history and preserved decay. My flashlight's beam trembled as I scanned the space, my breath shallow. Work tables were cluttered with half-restored relics, glass display cases draped in sheets like corpses awaiting their final unveiling. The shadows here felt different, denser, heavier. And then I saw it. The warrior statue. It stood near the center of the room, surrounded by incomplete restorations, its once weathered features smooth and pristine. This wasn't the same statue from the exhibit. It couldn't be. But its stance, its presence, it was identical. I stepped forward, my heart hammering. That's when I noticed the others. Lining the far wall were statues in varying states of repair. Some missing limbs, others with only half-formed faces, their expressions frozen between anguish and rage. The restoration team had been working on them, reconstructing what time had taken. But time hadn't taken these pieces. Something else had. My fingers trembled as I reached for a file lying on the nearest table. The restoration notes detailed their origins, excavated from an ancient temple, their history largely unknown. But the last entry chilled me to my core. Artifacts exhibit unexplained movement. Adjustments made overnight do not match recorded progress. Staff reports feelings of being watched. Proceeding with caution. I set the file down, my skin cold. The statues weren't just moving now. They had always been moving. The restoration team had seen it too. A noise behind me. A soft scrape. A whisper of stone against wood. I turned too fast, my flashlight catching movement just in time to see the edge of a shadow shift. The statues hadn't moved. Not exactly. But their positions felt different. A few degrees turned. A hand slightly raised. Their hollow, empty eyes locked onto me. I backed away toward the exit. Another flicker. The statues were closer. I slammed my shoulder against the door, but it didn't budge. The room was changing. The walls shifting. The restoration wing was no longer part of the museum I knew. It was something else now. I don't know how long I fought against that door before it finally gave way. When I stumbled out into the hallway, everything was wrong. The museum had transformed into a labyrinth of corridors that shouldn't exist, exhibits blending into one another, spaces that had never been connected now looping endlessly. I ran. I turned corners blindly, hoping for something, anything, that made sense. Then I saw the archive room. A place I had only been once before, where the museum stored its restricted artifacts, the ones too fragile or dangerous for public display. I hesitated. The rules screamed at me to turn back. Rule number 8, the archive room is not a shortcut. Do not enter. But the alternative was the endless maze, the statues closing in with every flicker of light. My options were running out. I stepped inside. The room was impossibly vast, shelves stretching into darkness, filled with relics that didn't belong in any timeline I knew. Objects pulsed with a strange energy, whispering secrets I couldn't understand. And in the center of it all, another statue stood. But this one was different. It wasn't a warrior. It was something older. Something waiting. The air grew thick, pressing against my chest as I moved closer. Unlike the others, this statue's face wasn't twisted in fury or agony. It was calm, expectant. A hand extended outward, palm up, as if offering something unseen. Then the whispers turned into voices. Take it. The words weren't spoken aloud. They bloomed inside my mind, curling around my thoughts like smoke. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the floor, my vision blurring. The weight of unseen eyes bore down on me from all sides. The voices grew louder. Take it. I didn't want to. I knew, deep in my bones, that accepting anything from this place meant giving up something in return. But I also knew I had no other choice. With a shaking hand, I reached out. My fingers brushed against cold stone, and the world around me shattered. I woke up in the security office. The monitors were normal. The museum was normal. No signs of the labyrinthine hallways, no statues where they shouldn't be. Had it been a dream? A hallucination? I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Exactly 1 minute after I had first blacked out. I sat there for a long time, staring at the screens, waiting for something to change. Nothing did. The exhibits remained still. The cameras displayed only what they were supposed to. But as I leaned back in my chair, my fingers grazed something in my pocket. I pulled it out with slow, deliberate movements, my stomach twisting. A small stone fragment. Smooth, cold, and unmistakably carved from the same material as the statues. I sat in the security office, gripping the small stone fragment in my hand. My mind raced with questions, but one thought overshadowed the rest. This was real. The museum looked normal again, silent, undisturbed, a lifeless collection of history. But I knew better now. The statues weren't just artifacts. They were something else. And whatever I had taken from that archive room, it had stayed with me. I turned the fragment over in my palm, tracing its smooth surface. A faint pattern ran along its edge, intricate carvings that almost seemed to shift under the dim glow of my desk lamp. I didn't remember picking it up. I didn't remember leaving the archive room at all. What had I done? I needed answers. And there was only one person who might have them. Martin Holloway had been the museum's head curator for over 3 decades. If anyone knew the truth about these artifacts, it was him. He rarely visited the museum after hours, but I had seen his contact information in the employee directory. I hesitated for only a moment before dialing his number. 3 rings. Then a click. Holloway. His voice was groggy, irritated. Mr. Holloway, I need to talk to you. It's about the statues. A long silence. Then, in a tone that sent a shiver down my spine, where are you? The security office. Stay there. Don't move. The line went dead. 15 minutes later, the museum doors groaned open. I watched from the monitors as Holloway stepped inside, his face shadowed beneath the brim of an old hat. He moved with urgency, his hands tucked deep into his coat pockets. I met him at the door of the security office. Tell me everything, he said before I could even open my mouth. So I did. I told him about the shifting exhibits, the impossible corridors, the way the statues had followed me in the dark. I described the archive room and the whispering voices, the way I had woken up as if nothing had happened except for the stone fragment in my hand. When I finished, Holloway looked older than I'd ever seen him. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. You weren't supposed to see that, he muttered. I clenched my fists. Where are they? Another long pause. Then, they were never meant to be found. Holloway gestured for me to follow him. We moved through the museum in silence, our footsteps echoing too loudly in the empty halls. He led me past the main exhibits, past the restoration wing, until we reached a door I had never noticed before. It was older than the rest of the building. The wood was dark, the handle rusted with age. Holloway produced a key from his coat and unlocked it with an audible click. This part of the museum isn't on the blueprints, he said. It's been hidden for years. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow stairwell spiraling downward into darkness. I swallowed hard. What's down there? Holloway didn't answer. He simply started descending. I followed. The air grew colder as we descended, the stone walls damp with age. Dim electric lanterns flickered along the passage, casting long, uneasy shadows. The deeper we went, the heavier the silence became. Finally, we reached another door, iron, reinforced, the kind that belonged in a vault rather than a museum. Holloway hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. What lay beyond stole my breath. The chamber was vast, lined with rows upon rows of statues. Hundreds of them. Some partially buried in the stone floor, others leaning against the walls as if frozen mid-motion. Their faces bore expressions of terror, of anguish, of pleading. These weren't just statues. They were people. Trapped. Preserved. I stumbled backward. This isn't a museum, I whispered. It's a tomb. Holloway nodded grimly. And you've already set something free. The realization hit me like a freight train. The stone fragment in my pocket, it was a key. A piece of whatever held these things in place. And I had taken it. I reached for it, intending to drop it, to put it back where it belonged, but the moment my fingers brushed against its surface, the statues moved. Not much. Just a twitch of fingers, a shift in weight. But it was enough. They can feel it, Holloway said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the tension beneath it. They know what you have. I clenched my fist around the fragment. How do we stop them? Holloway exhaled. We put it back. The statues moved again, closer this time. We didn't have much time. We ran. Holloway led the way through the underground chamber, weaving between the frozen figures. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel them behind us, their presence pressing against my mind like 1,000 unblinking eyes. The chamber opened into another passage, leading deeper still. At the end of it, an altar stood, carved from the same stone as the statues. A hollow space rested at its center, just large enough to hold the fragment. Holloway skidded to a stop. Put it back. I didn't hesitate. I shoved the fragment into the slot, my fingers numb from the cold. The reaction was immediate. The air rippled, a deep, guttural groan echoing through the chamber. The statues froze, their movement ceasing in an instant. The weight pressing against my mind lifted, leaving behind a ringing silence. It was over. Or so I thought. Holloway grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the altar. We need to go. Now. I followed him back up the passage, back up the winding stairs, until we burst through the hidden door and into the museum once more. Everything was still. Normal. I turned to Holloway. What happens now? He met my gaze, his expression grim. Now, we pretend this never happened. I frowned. But, if you're smart, you'll quit, he interrupted. You'll leave and never come back. I wanted to argue, to demand real answers. But deep down, I knew he was right. Some things weren't meant to be understood, and some secrets were better left buried.